Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my most excellent of co-hosts, Mackenzie. How are you?
Hello. Hello. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Living the
That's
dream.
good. We
Yeah.
love to hear it. What's your dream?
A midsummer's dream, one might say.
For your place to be seen like Marlowe's were.
Yes, exactly. Yay! References that no one's gonna get. What a lovely time. So,
It's just one of those things.
before we get started, as always, Patreon, just leave a review, all that good stuff. We get
Talk
extra
about
episodes.
beavers.
Hell yeah. Talk about police
Honestly,
officers.
yeah. Did we talk? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I forgot.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry, beavers are my Roman Empire.
I guess this episode is kind of a sequel to that All Cops Are Bastards episode that we did.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. Because fuck the police. But in the Yukon this time. Anyway.
Well, yeah, the RCMPs.
The RCMP. The worst police of all.
The worst all of Canada. God, them and their stupid hats.
Them and their stupid bomb settings. Whatever. Ugh. We'll talk about that another time. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about a topic that actually I've seen a lot of other podcasts talk about from like across the world. And I'm curious to get your impression, maybe by the end of the episode, as like why that might be. Like, of all the Canadian topics, why does this one get so much play in all kinds of other like informative historical podcasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if I have a definitive answer, but I think it would be an interesting like question to parse out. Anyway, today we're talking about the Mad Trapper, or the so-called Mad Trapper, as he was very quickly known in the media at the time, although there's a bit of contention about that term. Have you ever heard about the Mad Trapper, or Albert Johnson,
I
as he
might
was?
have.
Okay.
Again, living when I was in the Yukon for the summer, I think I might have.
And like, what do you remember of like maybe having heard of them? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, just the usual outlaw stuff, the evading the law, the trying to cross the border, the usual.
Yeah. I mean, who in the Yukon hasn't tried to evade the law? Let's be honest.
I mean, the border situation is honestly. I mean, did I tell you the story about my uncle with the strawberries?
No.
So he bought some strawberries in Alaska, and he was bringing them back into the Yukon. And the border patrol officer stopped him and said, you can't bring unprocessed produce over the border. And then the guy's like, but if you just cut the strawberries, that's processed, technically. So the border patrol, watching my uncle takes out a knife, cuts the strawberry. Like, he doesn't wash them, doesn't do anything else, just cuts them, like, in half.
That's
and he's like,
insane.
okay, you can bring your strawberries in.
Why would this be a thing? Why are you not allowed to bring
unprocessed goods into the, like, obviously I'm sure other places would be a lot more strict, like other like patrol officers or whatever. But like the technicality of the rule would make it so that like the cutting of the food is processing it.
But that's insane. Wow. I mean, technically also just putting water on it would process it.
Yeah.
But okay. Anyway. Weird.
Yeah. So that just goes to show, like, the border between U.S. and Canada it's stupid. It's like it's one of the longest. Is it the longest land border in the world?
Yeah.
It's the longest land border in the world.
It's the single land border, the single longest land border between two nations. Because like technically, I think Russia is the longest one, but it shares it with like so many countries. Yeah.
And it's just a joke. Like, it's just a joke.
And it used to be worse. So great, I guess. Like, it's slightly less of a joke now. But isn't there a place in Manitoba where it's like there's a trail that passes through the border, but there's no one there to guard it because there's almost never anyone who walks that trail. So there's just like a little box where you pass your passport or something like that. And it's like it just gives a video feed to the closest border crossing where there's actually someone, and they're like, yeah, sure, whatever.
I mean, again, like there's what nobody's defending the border in Canada.
Also, no one cares about Manitobans. So it's like, oh no, they're gonna come into the U.S. If they cause trouble, someone's gonna shoot them.
That town in Quebec where like you can cross the border by crossing the street.
Although are you talking about Roxham Road?
Maybe. Hold on.
Because they closed that one. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Oh,
Regardless.
it's just Stansted, Quebec.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Not the same thing.
Yeah, Stansted, Quebec, and the Derby line in Vermont.
And I imagine there's no one checking it. It's just like,
well, again, like, what are you gonna do? Like, oh, I need to go groceries. Better get my passport out.
I'm sure someone somewhere considered it.
Yeah. And well, again, I think it speaks more to the historical relations between the countries in that we are both the other's like largest trading partner.
And it also speaks to like the arbitrariness of borders as well. It's just some two old men in a boardroom decided it somewhere and without any actual. Yeah, exactly. They just drew
and then
a
nobody
straight
was
line.
Happy.
No, because like, oh, it crossed through my farm or some shit, and no one took the actual opportunity to check. Yeah. Anyway, the Mad Trapper. So this one's going to be a bit of a weird one where we start because we actually don't know much about who this guy is, right? Like he's given the name Albert Johnson, but that's not his real name by all accounts. He wasn't found with any identification on him. He just literally shows up in the Northwest Territories at some point, right? So that's where our story begins, is in the Northwest Territories.
Let's go.
Not in the Yukon, but there.
Northwest Territories, baby.
At the time, like you were required to register yourself with the authorities when you entered into that part of Canada because it's big, snowy, and there's no one. So if you go out hunting or if you're in an accident, like people need to be aware that, hey, there's someone missing, right? Or that this person hasn't checked in for X amount of time, right? So there are records of officers encountering what seems to be the Mad Trapper, and then the dude just kind of vanishes into the Northwest Territories to show back up again in 1932, where he basically manipulated some traps that were set by the local indigenous population and the Inuits, right? And that's where the term trapper came from, the Mad Trapper, because this whole debacle started because some people complained to the local authorities that there was just some asshole messing with their trap lines. so
oh God.
The cops show up in the area and find a little cabin, right? And this is where our story officially begins, because on January 2nd, 1932, Constable McDowell goes up to interview the man named Albert Johnson at his cabin in the woods. And McDowell approached with three people, right? Constable A.W. King and two special constables. And just as King, one of the constables, knocked on Johnson's door, without even any hello or anything like that, there was just a shot fired through the door. So that's how our story begins. And yeah, it's not a great start, let's just say, for Albert Johnson as far as making himself some friends in the area. And this would basically kick off like one of the longest manhunts in Canada's history, right? In part, I assume,
baby.
Yay! In part, I assume just because of the area that it took place in, because I can't imagine that there would be that big of a manhunt if this had happened in like Gatineau or something like that, right? Like people would have been on him pretty quickly. But because
Mhm.
there's like 3 people living in the Northwest Territories at this time, you can easily just kind of get away. um, so there's a shot that passes through the door and hits King.
Mhm.
Um, McDowell as well is almost hit by a rifle shot, and basically they immediately abandoned the attack on Johnson's cabin. Right, like not a great start for the RCMP in this one. They're like, okay, let's go investigate this guy who, dealt with some traps. Oh, we got shot. Fuck this. We as cops are not meant to deal with this, so they leave.
Well, it's it's like the start of a bad horror movie, you know?
Yes, please elaborate.
Well, it's the start of a bad because it's that opening scene in the horror movie when you have the people who first go to inspect the haunted house, the farm, whatever, and then one of them gets injured and they just hightail it out of there, never to be seen again, almost.
Yeah, it's the cold open, and
Yeah.
it's like the characters that they don't get named, right? They're just there, they die, and it sets the stakes for the entire like
So
movie.
how
Yeah,
many was it just
it was
the
four
one
people.
with yeah, 4 people, one of them gets shot, and the others
One of
have
them gets
to
shot,
get
one of
out of
them
there.
almost. Yeah, so they're like this guy. King's injuries were considered very serious, so they get out of it.
Right, okay, so I can get that though. Like,
Yeah,
because again, they probably like how are they supposed to know what this is going to become?
no, they have no idea.
Yeah. Nobody would.
Because in their mind, they're like, well, we'll just come back,
Yeah,
and
he's
that's
just
fine.
some mad trapper, whatever.
Yeah, he doesn't even have this term yet. He's just some guy. Right? Um,
Yeah.
and they come back 10 days later, which I'm kind of surprised that it took that long for them to come back. I guess it's because of the distances they have to travel.
Mhm.
But it takes them 10 days to return on January 12th, 1932, this time led by Inspector Eames, who would kind of be a running figure throughout this whole story. So they were fearful of an ambush because of their experience with the first time, and they basically decided, okay, this time we're going to basically rush the cabin. We're just going to run up to it because we have no protection. We're in the middle of the woods. There's a river on one side. There's nothing. So we either rush it
Good.
or we have no protection. And we're in the middle of winter.
And
So
again, one
not
guy,
great.
he can't shoot everybody.
And yet, little did they expect what happened next, which is, I guess, act one of this horror movie that's unfolding.
Yeah.
Um, wherein the rush to the cabin was unsuccessful because there was heavy fire from not one, but 2 automatic weapons that Albert Johnson apparently had in his possession that were just firing indiscriminately out of the cabin.
God damn it. He can't shoot all of us. Yes, he certainly can.
Hold my beer, said he
Hold my
with a
moonshine,
beaver.
more likely.
Hold my beaver.
Hold my hold my beaver tail. Hold my beaver juice.
um, so eventually, because of like reloading and all of that Johnson would have to do, the door to the cabin was eventually smashed in a little bit. And what the inspectors and the officers were managed to see from those holes were that Johnson had actually in those 10 days dug a hole in the ground that was about 5 feet deep, and he was
Hmm.
able to basically hide in it. So even if they shot into the cabin, he would be protected because he somehow dug a hole in the hard, ground of winter in the Northwest Territories. What a guy!
My king.
But like this kind of this does kind of set the scene a little bit because you don't really imagine this, but obviously you got snow and all of that, but like dirt gets hard real fast. Like
and
it's obviously fucking cold.
dirt gets hard real fast. No, people come here for just the most like high level commentary.
But what the reason why I'm saying this is like this is one of the things that people often noted in their interactions with the Mad Trapper was like he was surprisingly strong. And this kind of does indicate this is like you do have to have a certain amount of like strength and upper body strength in order to dig into frozen dirt in the middle of winter.
Yeah.
And yeah, like it is noteworthy in this case. So you'd think that after this unsuccessful attempt, they would also just go home, but no, the gunfire continued for about 15 hours after this
God.
initial skirmish.
Because they just were having so much fun.
Yeah. They were like, you know what? This is the sunk cost fallacy. We're in here for the long haul. Might
We're
as
in
well
it
keep
to
going
win it, baby. Shit it to win it.
because otherwise it would make the RCMP look like chumps. So
Something that the big hats and red jackets don't already do.
exactly. And that numerous scandals in the future will not solidify at all. So what makes me most laugh about this story, which I'm sure for the inspectors and Johnson were like quite traumatic because what 15-hour firefight wouldn't be quite a disaster on your psyche, is that they waited until about 3 a.m. before using high explosives, which I'm like, why? Why did you wait that long? you you were shooting for 15 hours.
They probably wanted to try and catch him asleep.
But they already knew he was alive. He was awake.
Yeah, but
I guess.
listen, they were trying to logic without understanding that these men do not have logic. Men like this do not have logic.
I guess. Or he was just like, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of hard to like critically analyze or like mentally analyze this guy because we know so little about him. He just literally pops up and
He's a
dies
specter.
later.
He is the Ghost
Yeah,
Protocol.
he's a James Bond villain, and it's somehow better than most James Bond villains. So they wait till about
like the
yeah,
dude
go ahead.
has there's no motive to this man.
No.
And in doing so, you can attach any motive you want to him, which I'm sure people do.
We will certainly get to this. What kind of motive? Don't answer yet, but write down, listeners, on a piece of paper. What kind of motive do you think, in the middle of the Depression, do you think people will give to this guy who's fighting the cops on his own?
Pushing
Answer
back
now
against
on
the
a
government oppression overlords.
There you go. You were not supposed to say it now, Mac. Jeez.
I was just taking my best guess. Honestly, it's not that hard. If our listeners didn't get that, then like I'm gonna be like disappointed in our listeners.
Well,
I expect only
shots
the
fired
most
at our listeners.
intellectual. I only expect the most intellectual people to listen to our brain dead podcast. I want the smartest morons only.
I love the contrast in our podcast between the interviews that I do and our conversations.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure your interviews are like deep, thoughtful, thought-provoking. Meanwhile, we're here. Dirt is hard when it's cold. Actual PhD candidate Patrick, you're.
I'm not going to apologize for this one. Like you come here for the memes, but you stay here for the like strong commentary, like that permeates the memes. It's all spectacle.
Well, again, you can already see the legend being born here from like this man with like we have a name, but we like because people have to understand in the time of the frontier, any frontier, records were not super well kept.
No.
Especially in a time like the Great Depression.
It is such a modern invention.
Like, yeah, no, the whole idea of record keeping is very much an urban invention more than anything else.
Oh, yeah.
Like when you're living out in the bush, people are just doing things for like, oh, I just did that thing for cousin Tommy.
Yeah, exactly. Like records or permits or anything like that is like it is not at all any kind of relevant.
When the reality is, this man was just probably insane. Like this man was just probably mentally unwell and just like lost his shit. As as men living in cabins in the middle of the woods are wont to be.
Right? Like that's literally one of the first novels in Canada. Literally talks about that. It's like staring out into the wilderness and going mad, right? Or we're facing the potential of going mad, right? Like that is a foundational premise of Canadian literary theory is the garrison mentality, which we've talked about on this show before, like coming together in order to face the insanity that is caused by the openness of Canada.
That's why Canadians are so funny. We're just insane.
We just snap as soon as we're born.
We just snap as soon as we see a hockey rink. We just snap. Something deep inside us snaps at the ever moving expanse of ice.
And that's why we love beavers.
Yeah, the beavers keep the ice away with their dams.
I like this myth building that we're doing right now.
Listen,
Immediate
I'm not saying. Listen. All right. I'm just saying, like, what do you have to do to get a lake? You have to build a dam. And then what do you lakes provide us with? What is an ice rink if not a man-made lake that's frozen? Who else
like dirt
creates lakes and then freezes them? Beavers.
Boom.
Boom.
Comes full circle.
It's all connected, folks. Just open your eyes. The symbol for the Montreal Canadiens kind of looks like a beaver dam.
So they said explosives, right? Somehow, this also fails.
Of course, the explosives fail. This is a Looney Tunes cartoon now. I'm sorry, but like this is just like Albert Johnson is just Bugs Bunny, and this is Elmer Fudd. Like
it's not that it like technically the explosives go off, but they don't have the desired effect. So it is even more like a Looney Tunes cartoon.
Yeah. Well, again, like you can just imagine, like Elmer Fudd breaks down the door shooting, and he misses because Bugs has dug a 5-foot pit instead.
That's exactly what happens. They blow a hole, and then they start getting fired upon by this man who was able to hide in the hole. The explosion.
God, so, reality truly is stranger than fiction.
So this guy basically, once again, like just manages to beat back well-prepared cops because eventually they start running out of supplies. And so he basically gets the siege
probably got like a fucking pit full of deer carcasses.
Yeah, because he fucked with people's traps. So of course.
And they probably didn't even think about it. They probably didn't think about what happened to the traps. I swear to God, like there was no consideration for that part. Oh, that's
we're like not even 2 weeks into this whole thing, and this has already gone off the rails completely, and it's the best thing that I've read in a long time. Yeah, which is funny considering like the novel treatment that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But like, this is hilarious. So obviously, because they're basically facing a one-man siege, they head back. Their provisions were running low after 15 hours, their ammunitions and all of that. So they return to the nearest town of Aklavik, and they return a little over a week later on January 20th. So they're going back to Rat River, which is where Albert Johnson was holed up, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And this time, they do not find a madman with apparently unlimited ammo, like a video game villain, but they find an empty cabin. He managed to flee because of course
he took a wrong turn at Albuquerque, I guess. Oh my God. So
they arrive there, and he's basically somewhere in the frozen Arctic tundra.
Because of course they never planned for the possibility this man might get away. And because here's the
No.
thing, I get why they don't train for that because it's just one guy. And here's the really, I'm gonna say, the fun part of
Sure.
civilization, because the fun part of society and civilization is the image part, because things can't look a certain way. Things have to look a certain way. So obviously you
Hmm.
can't look like this one mad trapper is a bigger deal than he is. So you can't like
Yeah.
set up a perimeter. You can't set up a thing to make sure he just doesn't run away into the Arctic tundra. But
That's
then
right.
obviously that's what happens, and already you lost the image game.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And it's like, oh, it's so funny. It's madness in its purest form.
So the image game really settles in at this point because this is where you start to get news, right? By the time, like,
Well,
news obviously
this is
travels a
how your
lot,
country becomes a laughing stock.
right? But like, I don't know how much the story went outside of Canada, but certainly within Canada, by the time they lost track of Johnson, um, the story is able to make its way into like the mainstream or like the more civilized, I guess, parts
Hmm.
or urban parts of Canada. And that's where you start to see, like you say, this image making or this framing of the Mad Trapper as just someone who wanted to live on his own and is stopped by the man, right?
Hmm.
The government stooges, the fascists or whatever, right? That are just stopping someone from living his best life during these very, very hard times of the literal depression. Um, which of course is a bit of a stretch, but it's the same way that like Bonnie and Clyde were made into figures, right? They were literal criminals, but they were turned
Again,
into
here's the thing though.
these
This man
romantic
is
figures.
barely a criminal. He didn't
Right.
rob a bank. He didn't commit murder. He messed
Yet
with some traps.
he did shoot people and he will commit murder.
Yeah, here's the thing though. We will do a lot of things, but he hasn't done that yet.
Hmm.
He messed with some traps, and he shot, like, when he was messing with the traps, did he shoot at some hunters then?
No.
No,
It
he was just
as far as
messing with traps. Like,
yeah.
this wasn't supposed to be this. He was just supposed to be some coot out in the woods messing with, like, with people's traps. And then it
No.
turns out he's goddamn John Rambo, firing two automatic weapons, like, off of his hips or something.
Oh, see, that would be a great movie though.
But he's also Bugs
You
Bunny.
but he's also Bugs Bunny. But like you do make that. You make the John Rambo thing, except instead of the Vietnam War, he comes back shell shocked from the First World War and escapes into the Arctic. There you go. It writes itself.
Like, this man was just messing with some traps. How did we get? It's like the little memes with the dominoes, right? Like,
Yep.
like Madman messes with traps at Rat River is this first tiny domino. We haven't reached the big domino yet, but it's starting already to get pretty big. Of like, now we have to make sure he doesn't escape into the Arctic, or else we look like fools.
Right. And so it takes a little bit of time to actually get this whole thing organized. But by the end of January, they're sending out basically what is it, like a small militia, right? To actually find Johnson in the wooded areas. Because, there's only so far that you can get by foot, right? In the Arctic, in the middle of winter, like you can only go so far, right? You can be Bugs Bunny all you want. You can't walk faster than like the average man.
Hmm.
And so eventually, towards the end of January, their Staff Sergeant Radel and other men were looking for Johnson, and suddenly they are fired upon in the middle of woods, right? And they don't know where this fire comes from, but he's basically firing at them. Um, and so there's a shootout that starts to happen in the northern woods. Um, and for a while it's quiet, and they think, okay, well maybe we got him. He might have been wounded or killed, but it's rather quiet. And it stays that way for about 2 hours. Um, and they start to approach his last known position. And it's at that moment that um, that Constable Millen, who was one of the people there, got close to Johnson, close enough for Johnson to shoot him and kill him.
Mhm.
And this is where like the stakes really get higher because now a police officer has died, right? And that's at least it gives greater impetus for people to find this man
Yeah.
because now someone's
No.
died.
Yeah, no, now somebody's dead. And again, it's just that escalation. And they're like, the way they choose to escalate the hunt is again almost a Looney Tunes cartoon.
Yep.
Because what do they do, Patrick? So obviously a man has died. Very sad, very tragic. Like, we need to find Albert Johnson. We need to take him down. But like,
Let's
the
ramp it
way
up
they
to
just
11, motherfucker.
let's bring in the guy who shot down the Red Baron.
Everyone deserves to be connected. That's why Cox offers a range of high-speed internet plans that fit any budget. Stream, chat, and stay connected at an incredible price. It's fast, reliable internet for everyone. You're probably thinking, wait, what? But yeah, it's true. Learn more at cox.com/ACP. Non-transferable, one per household. Application and eligibility decisions are made by the FCC. Other restrictions apply.
Who's the Red Baron for people who might not know?
Oh my God. So the Red Baron, if you've never seen a Snoopy cartoon, the Red Baron is one of the most famous fighter pilot aces of all time. He fought for Germany in World War I. He shot down a bunch of aircraft, like just known as being one of the most dangerous fighter pilots to ever live. And he eventually dies. He gets shot down.
Yes.
One of the people who helped shoot him down was a man by the name of, or apparently one of the people who shot him down, man by the name of, what is it, Wap May?
Yeah, Wap is his surname, of course. Like his nickname. I forget. I didn't write down what his real name was because everyone refers to him as Wap. So yeah,
Wap.
Captain May. So yeah, because he was a close friend and the preferred pilot of Eames. And so they were like, okay, well, let's call down to Edmonton and get someone who's able to fly over and actually, help us find Johnson, which is insane to me because, air support. Why do you need the ace? You could just get a guy with a plane. You're just looking for him to fly. You don't need him to do pirouettes in the sky and take down. Johnson's not in a plane.
Johnson's a trapper. He's just a fucking trapper. He messed with some traps, you guys. This is getting way out of hand.
Yep. So by then, like, they still had no idea, right?
Well, again, this is escalating, but they can't. They only send 2 guys off into the Arctic.
Yeah, and half of them died.
Technically, yes, half
of. So for all the jokes that we that we make, so they do ramp up the thing, and they're like, basically, it's dead or alive for this guy, and they do the instructions is like, whether he's dead or not, we still actually want to identify them. Right, so like be sure to like take fingerprints and all of that because we still don't know. We still don't know. Yeah, it's like, is he some kind of kook from the States or anything like that? Yes. But like they want to know for reasons who this guy is, right, to better identify him. And basically, so Wap May is actually credited with the guy with being the person who would spot Johnson from the air, right? And the way that it happens is basically Johnson is cornered eventually and was offered no escape, but still, despite being cornered, he continued to shoot at the RCMP and try to evade capture as much as possible. But an increasing number of police officers would eventually kind of like encircle him with the plane flying overhead. It was like a matter of time in this case. And it took a while. So from January 31st, when Constable Millen was shot, to when RCMP headquarters got the announcement that Johnson was shot and killed by police, it was a little over 2 weeks. And by that time, he had made it into the Yukon and all of that. So
We
it
love
was,
the Yukon.
yeah. So ultimately, like I said, it lasted about 48 days, so a little over a month and a half in this case of looking for one dude who fucked with traps, and spanned about 240 kilometers in length. Insane, right? For what was basically a guy walking. And yeah, there's evidence that has since come out, right, that suggests that maybe that Johnson used the name Arthur Nelson when he was in northern British Columbia and the Yukon sometime between like 1926 and 1931. And recently, there's like DNA testing that had been done on his body because they kept it. That suggests that he might have been from the US or Scandinavia. It's one or the other, but like that's as much as we know.
Exactly. Like, what did they think taking his fingerprints was going to get them? Again, that's the crazy part. If there's no record, there's no record. You can't like
like they assume that
need this dude.
They 1932 didn't me this dude. It's like the fingerprints would have only worked if he had already had a prior criminal record, which he didn't.
He was just a kook living in a cabin.
So anyway, so this is basically the story that a lot of people have to work with. And I wanted to just talk a little bit because I know you didn't really have time to read the novella. But once again, we're returning to show favorite Rudy Wiebe in this case and his novella, The Mad Trapper, which is, of course, inspired by these events. So Rudy Wiebe, dude, but in this case, I'm digging him because I like his writing style, but he's not the only one to have written a novel on The Mad Trapper. There's a lot that came out in like the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Look, I'm sorry if I choose one of the greatest writers in this country's history. But it is kind of interesting to see, I think, where authors take these types of figures when they have the liberty to do so. Because especially with a figure like Johnson, you have more myth than fact, right? Like you have the outlines of a story, but then
you don't have any fact with this man.
But like you have the fact of like who he shot and when he was in the Northwest Territories for like 48 days. That's about as close to the facts that you
no, it's very obvious. Any story about Albert Johnson is going to be so detached from reality as to be a reality unto itself.
Exactly.
Like this dude was already at like the third level of the simulacra.
It just jumped straight into it.
Like genuine, like this story, it's like the story of the Titanic where it's too fake. It's too fake to be true, and that's what makes the truth of it all that more compelling.
Oh, that's really interesting. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you want to explain a little bit more?
No, like quick history on the Titanic. It just the story is so like there's such a romantic edge to it that it can't if you tried to pitch this as a plot of a fictional story, for example, to a movie executive, you'd be laughed out of the room for the absurdity of it.
Yes, that's right.
Because that's what the Titanic was. It was the ship's first maiden voyage. The owner was on board. It was the captain's last job. And there's so many other details we can't get into right now about the Titanic.
Sure.
That makes it sound such an impossible. This is the same thing. Random kook trapper found in the woods was actually dug into with a large set of supplies, ran off and hid into the 48 days in the Arctic tundra. The man who shot down the Red Baron helped to track him down from a plane.
And I think that's one of the interesting things that
And so
we
in the trying to tell this story,
yeah
to capture the history of it, you would have to create a story that is so fake as to like the story that Weeb has to create has to be so fake just to rise to the actual absurdity of the level of history. In the same way that
exactly.
Jack and Rose is such a stupidly romantic plot as to match the romanticism of the Titanic.
But that's the thing is like, despite it being stupidly romantic and like the Titanic or like absurd like the Mad Trapper story, it both the novel and the Titanic movie come off as genuine.
Yes,
And
there's a sincerity to them.
exactly, there's a sincerity to it. The reason why the James Cameron movie works is because they don't play it as silly, right? The characters truly believe in the love that they're depicting on screen, right? It's the Romeo and Juliet thing all over again, to come back to that
When I
Shakespeare
say like
discussion.
absurd
But like,
and romantic, I don't mean fake. Like these things are like
no.
things can be unbelievably absurd and unbelievably sincere.
Sure, absolutely, right. I'm adding on to what you're saying here, and like I feel like we, in order to make it sincere and not stupid, because it's not a comedic novella, right? What I think he does interestingly is kind of zooms out on the situation itself, and he focuses more on the conditions and what is happening on a more meta discussion, if you will, of like what's happening that would cause someone like Johnson to exist in the first place, right? And I saw one critic that explained it well. So he seems to frame the story versus as a battle between like the frontier spirit of self-reliant independence and the hydra of our ultra complex and impersonal civilization, right? So modernity versus right the traditional kind of openness, if you want, versus the frontier, right? Which is not like an original story that happens a lot, right? But it is an interesting frame for this story in particular, right? With the police being the stand-ins for the ultra complex and machine of modernity, because that's what they are, versus this guy who just wants to screw with traps. Yeah. I don't
Meanwhile,
know.
Spike Millen becomes our Clint Eastwood figure in it all.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And in order to do that, like that's where you're correct in saying like he fucks with history, because Spike Millen dies, or Captain dies at the end of the novel, which wouldn't have been the case in the real Albert Johnson story. He died 2 weeks before Albert Johnson did. So it's like little things like this that Weeb changes. And yeah, I don't know where to start with this novel, because I don't know like what your approach to it would be in this case. I guess someone who's kind of like more distant from the novel. Yeah, how would you approach this?
Sorry, repeat the question.
Yeah, sorry. Like, how would you approach this novel? Or this story? Like, how do you want to talk about this? Because you didn't read as much of it.
We could just work through the themes like we usually do. I think we just go through the pages as you have them set up. You read them to me like a bedtime story. I fall asleep. All's well.
Wow. I mean, I guess we can talk about Millen as a character.
Yeah, well, I think that's the most, because that's going to be the most contentious issue, and I think that's the part people are going to take most issue with.
Yeah.
Is the taking of this man who actually died and then changing his story, whereas it might have been better to create a fictional composite cop to represent all the.
It's weird because he does create a fictional cop. His name is Paul Thompson in the novel. And Thompson takes the place of the real Millen, right? He's the one who dies at the turning point of the story, right? So
because if you really look at the story, Millen is just kind of like a footnote in it. He's not a main character in the history.
There is no main character aside from Johnson. I guess Eames. Like, he's the only one who's there from the beginning.
Yeah, each like this feels like as a novel it would have been much better to tell it totally from Johnson's perspective.
Yeah, we can get to that a little bit later
I love
because
when
there
we
is a.
hypothetical story make.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, why not? We're both literature students. We can do this. Um, but why would you? I guess this would be a question I would have for you. Like, why make Millen the counterpart if he's going to create characters anyway? Like, why not just create a character that's going to be that counterbalance and have him or her be the kind of antagonist in the story? Why stretch out Millen's story particularly? Is it because it makes the death, his actual historical death, more dramatic? Like, what would you say to that? Hmm.
I think part of it must be that looking at these notes, Millen seems like the most everyman character, or the most
Yeah,
everyman person in this story. But again, the real conundrum to me is why not just create a whole new character for this?
but exactly. Yeah, that's exactly like I'm
I
wondering
don't.
why. Yeah,
Hmm.
go ahead.
No, I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Like, why then? I don't
Yeah,
know if he was trying to say something, trying to ground the plot a bit more in the history and the reality.
I don't know because what's kind of interesting is that so he does a lot of things with Millen in a surprisingly short novel. This novel is only about
Hmm.
200 pages long,
Yeah.
and that the character he creates, the other police officer character, Paul Thompson, is interesting because he is like Spike Millen. He's a younger, brasher Spike Millen.
Yeah.
And what the novel kind of constructs for him is that in trying to take down Johnson, he slowly becomes like Johnson, right? And so the novel frames Paul Thompson, this fictional cop, as someone who dies before he reaches that point of madness, thereby
Hmm.
representing what will happen to Spike Millen if he follows this particular path. So I guess Spike Millen is put into this position of being the antagonist in order to present him more heroically. Because
Hmm.
if he actually killed him off in the moment when he did die, it wouldn't have fit the aesthetics of the novel in the more conventional sense.
But
Which
then
I
the
guess,
fictional
yeah.
character also died.
Yeah, but he died for the purposes of representing thematically what Spike Millen could become, right? Which, yeah, I don't know.
It's just, I think it's just one of those I think it's just one of those creative decisions that maybe just didn't think all the way through.
Yeah, that seems to be like a lot of the critical reception I saw for this novel was just like, look, mad respect to Rudy Wiebe, but like this is not one of his stronger outputs. There's
No.
some weird choices that are happening here.
Well, again, it's one thing to pick an urban legend to write a story about,
Mhm.
but then it's just you either have to go all the way or
Yeah.
not, or stick solely to the facts. And I don't think he
Yeah.
got caught in this awkward middle ground with this.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I feel like he does do some interesting stuff with Millen. Like he creates a parallel. Like him and Johnson have all kinds of parallels that are very interesting. Like Millen's the community order, but not too authoritarian, right? So he does parallel Johnson in the sense as he thematically represents a more freewheeling spirit in an otherwise
Mm,
oppressive world of police authority, right? Whereas Johnson also represents that, but on the scale of the entirety of society. So there are parallels there that are created. Um, he, it when when Johnson actually kills a man, presumably in cold blood, right? That shatters Millen's worldview. right? He becomes completely disenchanted with his project, and like bringing him thematically a little bit closer to and being a very jaded and cynical person in the face of modernity, right, rather than the humanist that he started out with. So like there is some interesting stuff. I don't want to give Rudy Wiebe like too much shit. Right? He does create a compelling narrative. I feel like he tried to do a lot though.
Okay, no, I
With
can't speak to the actual. I
yeah,
just feel like this decision with the Spike Million is just a little
yeah,
strange, and it seems
yeah,
indicative of the overall problem with them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Go ahead.
It didn't go. He didn't go far enough. I personally, I'm looking at this. If I was to write it, I would write it from the perspective of Albert Johnson, and I would actually have it be. I would have him quite literally being a trapper that messed with some traps, and things are quickly spiraling out of his control.
Oh, interesting.
So
Like
I would have like,
is he crazy or no?
no, he's just caught up in circumstances that are escalating beyond his like control, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting because like the novel, I won't say the novel plays with that much, but it it's a bit difficult for the. I think you're right. It would certainly make Johnson more sympathetic, right?
Well, because again, I think
As
that's any story that needs to go like this. It's like with any of Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, or whatever.
yeah,
You need to follow the villain more than anybody else because they are the one that you can get away with the most fictitious parts of.
yeah,
You can
exactly.
only be so fictitious with inspectors and constables from that time because we know they existed.
Yeah, exactly. Um, the it is kind of interesting because what Reed decides to do instead with Johnson is to make him a kind of silent figure. He does
Mm.
talk, but whenever he does talk, it's very short
Hmm.
and he kind of trails off most of the time. And there's a really good passage towards like a third into the novel, just before chapter 8, where he says his mouth opened as if words were actually shaping themselves there. Never
Right.
smile at a woman, he murmured out loud, not actually talking nor singing either, but making a sound somewhere between the two. Call no man your friend, if you trust. His voice trailed away into silence. He dropped the 2 pills into his mouth, lifted the tea tin, and washed them down.
Hmm.
Um, so like this idea of this kind of character who's unable to express himself um, in the ways that would make him most understood, I think definitely permeates the novel. But yeah, he never quite makes him the protagonist, at least
Hmm.
not in the conventional sense, which I think could be an interesting like way of going about it.
Like
But yeah,
that's
go
just
ahead.
my personal opinion of how I would have handled the actual trapper
Hmm.
in the story is by having him take on this sort of like he was, I don't know, he was a desperate figure. He messed with some traps because he was hungry, starving for food. The cops come
Do you,
knocking at his door. He thinks it's something else, fires off some shots, accidentally hits a cop, and he just slowly starts digging himself farther and farther into this hole he can't go back from. Because what's he
and
supposed
that
to do?
and
Like,
therefore
in,
the Bugs Bunny hole becomes an actual thematic like piece of imagery.
yeah, well, at that point, like, what are you supposed to do? You shoot a cop. It's like, well, you're jail for life now, buddy. Like, your
Yeah,
life is ruined anyway. How are you supposed to
and
go back?
I wonder if part of the decision to make him this almost silent character, which by the way is another parallel that happens in the novel. Like the novel literally opens with almost complete silence. I mean, there's just
Hmm.
nothing in the great white north. So the environment itself is
There
silence.
is nothing in the Great
Like
White North.
that's true.
It's great.
Um,
It's white. It's in the north.
but like what I'm wondering is like this character is so silent that I'm wondering if we made it that way in order to be able to be this blank slate,
Mm.
similar to how the historical Johnson was such a blank slate and such an enigma to people that we were able to ascribe to him this Billy the Kid type heroic status in the midst of the Depression. And I'm wondering if that's what Wiebe was trying to go with by doing this. But obviously this is purely speculation. I have no idea. But yeah. Yeah, I don't know. There's also like Millen also parallels Johnson's voice in that sense. I saw another critic who referred to Millen as the completion of Johnson as far as that voice is concerned, right? Where Johnson seems to be frozen, much like the silent Arctic that he's a part of, right? And that's why he can't get words out of his mouth. So he's a figure that's frozen in time, right? Representing the antithesis of like hyper rapid modernity. Whereas Millen is often described in like more warm and in terms that thaw the voices or the words and the representations that Johnson can't seem to get out. And that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the institution of modernity, so to speak, as like liberating certain thawed aspects of life. And I don't know how you feel about that. Yeah.
About the flawed aspects of life, or
the thawed, sorry, not flawed. As modernity as like thawing, THAW, like some of the like frozen aspects of pre-modernity.
Thawing some, but freezing other parts. Like modernity also very much dehumanized everything. Like it froze our ability to show compassion in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely something to be said for the use of the Arctic tundra as a way of both discussing what is both seen and unseen, frozen and unfrozen.
Yeah.
I think it goes both ways.
For sure. I think it also freezes in the sense of like, you're right, it kind of flattens out. Modernity is like has had a tendency to flatten out so many aspects, which I think is interesting when considering this in the context of the novel, where slowly each of the characters are fighting against becoming basically one character, right? Johnson is fighting against becoming like Millen like Johnson, and Thompson literally dies because he's becoming so much like Millen. Right? So like there's a resistance to like this flattening out of character. Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't know what you were going to say.
No, you're all good.
Okay. One last point I wanted to mention about this novel, because it's getting late here.
Yeah, it's getting long for this episode.
Yeah, that too. But we keep referring to him as Mad, and it's kind of interesting because we know so little about Johnson that Wiebe does also take this moment to consider whether or not he was mad in the sense of like crazy, or if, like you were saying, he was just a man that was faced with circumstance. And towards the end of the novel, on page 100, Constable Eames is a character in this, and he says to a young reporter, "Now I want you to have 3 facts very clear, or you will not receive another word of information on this case. 1, we have no evidence that Johnson has tracked anything. 2, we have every evidence that that he is not mad. And the 3rd fact is, I will not have it broadcast outside the outside that the RCMP are hounding some poor demented character out of his lonely cabin into the Arctic winter." So it's interesting where he was like, no, I genuinely don't believe that this guy is crazy. But he also has a vested interest in not calling him crazy, because then it makes the cops look bad to call him crazy, because then you're just harping on this guy who doesn't know better, right? And yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that particular idea.
No.
Of like his like sanity or anything like that, or why it might be interesting to consider whether or not he was mad.
I mean, mad by the standards of who, you know,
Yeah, exactly.
mad by, which I think is the point, obviously.
Yes, exactly. A question that will obviously never be answered. Like he's not going to go through like psychological testing at this point. But I want to come back to the question that I asked you at the start. Of all the topics that I've seen into podcast land, like this one has come up at least 10 times, just in like a random search on Spotify. And like, why do you think that would be? Why do you think like people outside of Canada are so invested in this story for telling it over and over again on like various historical podcasts?
It's the myth of it. We don't know who this man was, and so we can then graft anything we want onto him.
Right.
Whether it be the John Rambo, the Looney Tunes cartoon, the Depression, the post World War I soldier, like whatever you want to do, you can do to him, and it doesn't matter. Nobody will cry for Albert Johnson.
Right.
And so it's limitless potential, really.
I guess, yeah. It's limitless potential, and like, yeah, I think you said it. I'm not going to repeat what you just said. That's great.
Yeah, no, like he has no motivation. He has no family, no character. Like there isn't even like a jilted lover. There was just this man living in a cabin that messed with some traps.
Yeah, which is kind of like, I guess, completely different in scenarios, but I guess it's kind of the reason why true crime things are so popular as well, is because people try to look for motivations in sometimes the darkest points of history. Obviously, this one like is a bit funny in its premise, but it does follow the similar patterns of like wanting answers to things that fundamentally don't have.
Mm-hmm.
All right, fun episode. Mac,
awesome.
Next week we're gonna get full depression.
Let's go.
Yep, probably 2 episodes.
And then we'll get back to William Lyon Mackenzie King.
Probably, yeah. I have to check the actual list that I made, but yeah, something like that.
Let's go.
All right, Mac, what do we do over on Patreon?
Well, over on Patreon, we've got extra episodes, ad-free episodes, extended ones, full-length, no-edited ones, uncensored. We've got interviews all over the place. We've just got all sorts of stuff for people to see.
Bigger, longer, and uncut.
Yes, just like the South Park movie, including which is the series Pop Canada, which is a once-per-month type situation where me and Patrick just talk pop culture in Canada.
Yeah.
Topics picked by me.
Yeah. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, also leave a review. That's fun. Tell people about it. Or don't. Do whatever you want. All right. Thanks for this episode, Mac. It was always fun.
Thank you.